All right, so we are here today with Will Starks. I'm Josh Vogel. Will, if you don't mind, just for people who aren't familiar, you might introduce yourself and just telling people a little bit about you?
Yeah, so my name is Will Starks. I'm 31 years old, currently living in Brighton, Michigan. I have my family, Katie Collier and Apollo, my son. We are happily and thriving here in the eastern Midwest region. I'm a professional mixed martial artist, 11 and 3 currently. I have a 22 and 1 amateur background as well that includes two world title victories at the International Mixed Martial Arts Federation. I just
Cool.
recently claimed my first professional regional title. I am a brown belt in jiu-jitsu.
Congratulations.
Oh, yeah, thank you. It was fun. It was a return after about a year and a half hiatus. So we'll see where MMA continues from there. I have Gamma coming up next month in Brazil. That's a pro amateur kumite or mixed martial arts tournament. So it'd be cool to get a ton of cultural exposure there on top of I'm assuming some top level amateur and regional pro prospects as well.
Cool.
Um, Outside of that, I work alongside Mike Israetel and Crystal Guevara. I coach Crystal more so right now in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and then I train with Mike as well. I think they have aspirations for striking training down the road,
Cool.
but yeah, that's they have that portion, and then
Now, Will,
I'm a
with
student.
sports science, what is your background in sports science?
Yeah, so I'm still a student. My background is in exercise, sports science, and nutrition. I'm a certified personal trainer, certified nutritionist. I'm approaching the same courses, master level health coach nutrition certification this fall, which will qualify me for board certifications as a nutritionist. I'm pretty excited about that. I'm
Cool.
a licensed massage therapist, and I'm preparing for a neuroscience track here in Michigan, and I'll continue that through undergraduate, and then we'll see what academics looks like beyond that.
Cool. So what you're telling me is that you have a low stress lifestyle and you have plenty of free time.
I really I like to aim low. The lower the bar, the better. I just
That's what
feel
I'm
really awesome
sensing.
about
Yeah.
myself. Yeah.
It's like, you know what? I want to do cool stuff, but forget it.
Nah, that's
Well,
like
very cool. So, in addition to all that, you and I both share a love of um, cat shirts. I can see.
this is actually gaining a lot of traction in the MMA gym I'm training at. And a younger athlete walk up to me and he says, "I don't know what's changed since you moved here, but I've just been seeing cats all over your social media or in person. Like there's some hidden message behind the cat. We could probably build a conspiracy on that. I'm not sure. Maybe some like Egyptian Sphinx type thing with hidden spiritual undertones."
We'll start the building blocks of the conspiracy online, maybe on Reddit or something.
Yeah.
Um, cool, very cool. Well, awesome. Well, so I think let's start with your with mixed martial arts. You and I were talking about Gamma recently, and I was asking you because I wanted to check out the rule set, and just because I'm not familiar with, in general, I'm not that familiar with mixed martial arts rules, and then not and specifically those particular rules. So you said you're preparing for an event in Brazil in June.
Yes, sir. It's you want me to go and kind of unpack what I know about the rule set and the maybe even like the history of these, amateur pro mixed martial arts tournaments as they stand. It is kind of a recent development in the sport.
I think I think more like when I was asking about the rules, it was kind of like I know the basic idea, like MMA. If you submit person, or if you knock the person out, or if you're clearly dominant in the fight, at the end of the fight you win. But I think
Yeah,
with the rules, I was more like I wasn't familiar with the 10-point must scoring system, or
gotcha.
things like what are the criteria that the judges are looking for. So, for example, effective striking, effective grappling, effective
Yeah,
wrestling, and the sort of the hierarchy of what they're looking for, and
yeah,
then ring control and aggressiveness and stuff like that.
for sure.
So I think maybe a specific way to go into this with you would be, because I know you to be a highly organized mixed martial artist and just martial artist in general. When you're looking at what the judges are looking for in winning the game of mixed martial arts, how do you design your own game plan for that?
Yeah, so there is a general and specific plan. The general plan is to make sure that you are competent across the field. You've heard me probably cite this on my social media. For followers who have been listening to me for years, you'll know this, the unified field of martial arts. So that's the school of striking and the school of grappling and everything in between. So being as competent as you can in general areas across those schools in striking, thinking about boxing, Muay Thai. You see about as far as hard styles, and then everything from Dutch kickboxing to karate, taekwondo,
Mm-hmm.
etc. And then with grappling, wrestling and jujitsu. It's like nogi jujitsu, and probably I see a mix of both international and American like folk style wrestling being used to success in the pure grappling space, and honestly, in MMA, not quite as much on the wrestling end. Surprisingly, despite how often pure wrestlers tend to slingshot their way from their debut to to the top 15.
Yeah.
So general game plan is to make sure that when you're far away from competition, that you're addressing those areas individually, uh, and then as you get closer to competition, your training funnels into the integration of those individual skills,
Okay.
so that based on your weight class, your preference, like wherever your background leans toward, uh, or and then the opponent, in this case for a tournament, you kind of have to it's kind of a shotgun approach, which again is why it's important in your off season to be broad, generally competent across the field. That way you're never caught off guard if you have someone who is like maybe they're not a great grappler, but their country is just well known for kickboxing,
Right.
or vice versa. Their country is well known for sambo or wrestling, but they're not great strikers. You don't want to be in a position where you can't assert your style or your preference because the video game character that you are playing inside of your brain and your body can't express the counters to the
Right.
style. Um,
That
so
makes
so so
sense.
all so I actually think that kind of captures all of it. It's a sports science periodization is the term that we're really unpacking, and that's just taking a bird's eye view of your training with reference to competition and
Mm-hmm.
making sure that you're always prepared to shift gears for the specific demands of your sport. And then we funnel into the 10-point must system where for a standard 3 or 5 round bout, 3 minutes, 3 minute rounds for amateur, 5 minute rounds for pro. The winner of each round is awarded 10 points, and the loser is awarded 9 points unless they were unless they were dominated in extreme fashion
Right.
by the winner of the round who leveraged effective striking, grappling, aggression, and cage control. And those well, aggression, yeah, striking, grappling, aggression, yeah. So like those four areas are the unified rules of MMA across the
Mm-hmm.
board, and then they're just executed within the constraints of amateur, pro, and like local, state, regional, global like rule sets. In the case of this tournament, amateur rule sets, so no knees to the head, no elbows at all,
Okay.
and then no twisting ankle locks.
Gotcha.
So this it provides athletes really with an opportunity to get a ton of volume in their competition experience with less risks than a standard amateur. There are some amateur promotions that allow knees to the head, for instance.
Right.
There are some amateur promotions that are already allowing elbows. Not necessarily a bad thing. You could strategize. Like you have a new student who's ready, after a year or two of training in the general schools, they're ready to make an amateur MMA debut. You find a promotion like this where they have 7 ounce gloves instead of four, sleeve rash guards instead of none, with those safety, the bowling alley safety bars in essence. Uh,
Yeah.
you have them do that's, they get 3 to 5 fights in 1 week. It's a ton of volume. You get them doing that a few times.
Yeah.
Uh, that's a lot of fights. That's like a wrestling career
Yeah. I
in
mean, that's great
essence.
because then you can get all that. experience in the parts of MMA or the parts of a competition experience that are important and like transfer to, more dangerous versions of MMA or
Hmm.
more high risk versions of MMA without like, I mean, the sacrifice that you make for safety seems like it's so minimal that like you gain so much from the experience of doing fights like that, even if there's not knees to the head or whatever. Like all the
Hmm.
other parts of like preparing for a fight, the anxiety, the stress, the game
Yes.
planning, all those important parts of a fight, you get a chance to practice that over and over and over again. And then when you start doing, stuff with knees to the head or professional fights later on, you have this huge record, but you don't have the brain damage, you don't have the injuries, you don't have all the other stuff. So what a huge advantage that must be.
I think the sports psych portion that you touched on is probably the most important. That's even something my first MMA coach stressed, about getting all his athletes in there. He didn't have like a science-based per se approach to developing athletes then, and obviously this was 10 years ago. The entire sport was still new to structuring programs in a way that yields high outcome but reduces burnout and injury risks. It's kind of
Yeah,
like survival of the fittest, at that stage. But he touched so much on the importance of handling your emotions going into the fight and then while in the fight. And that's something, especially with a recent and developing interest in neuroscience and consciousness and just understanding how to consciously engage in learning material for any domain, but mixed martial arts in particular, and then have it shuttled off into, like the subconscious dialogue, that kind of operates in the background, and then eventually just your unconscious being, like you are reflexively competent at a high level because you engaged in a program that was structured as so.
yeah, that's super interesting. I think so. As with the periodization, this is something I do for my own jujitsu training as well, and probably not nearly as thoroughly as what you're doing, but um, as the event gets closer and closer and closer, and your preparation gets more and more and more specific, I assume that there's a point where, for example, in jiu-jitsu, there are some people that spend a lot of time focusing on understanding the rule set of the sport really thoroughly, and then that becomes a huge part of their game plan. So for example, like, if I know that I go for a single leg takedown near the edge of the mat and my opponent flees the mat and I get awarded 2 points for them fleeing the mat to get out of a single leg takedown, then maybe part of my preparation would be, when I train, making sure that I take the match as close to the edge of the mat as possible so that I can then force people into a choice between accepting the single leg takedown or fleeing out of bounds and giving me the 2 points anyway. And so I'm assuming there's a lot of situations like that in mixed martial arts where some people really dig deep into understanding how to not milk the rules, but really get the most out of the rules as far as like adding that to their game plan. And then I think there's also other people that are just like, all right, I know what's illegal, so I'm not going to do that. But other than that, I'm just going to scrap. And so then they
Yeah,
rely more on their own personal skill set, or maybe their skill set and factor in their opponent, but then maybe don't factor in the rules as much.
yeah.
How much of a, I guess, how much, like, if you have your game, your opponent's game, and then the environment, like the rule set that you're playing under, how much of each of those things do you personally focus on, or is it pretty even split for you when you're preparing for an MMA event?
Even and man, this is actually this conversation ties into what I had touched on before we started about so actually I have the sheet open here. It's a perceptual integration of multi-dimensional frameworks for combat sport evolution.
Okay.
And this is something that like I'm this is a new stage of my personal development, like my strategic development going into competition. So you'll kind of hear me sharing this as I'm building the tracks, and we'll be in essence be building the tracks together on this one.
Cool.
Uh, but something that I noted, let's see, this would have been 2021. Uh, like distance management was an like understanding distance management in striking was an entry point into zone management, right? So I use zone as a broader term for just addressing the space, but between and around you and the opponent. So the first thing is how far away are you from your opponent when you're trying to engage in striking or grappling, and how far away do you prefer to be to best execute your game or system? Game just being in striking, that could just be I'm setting up my head kick, and everything revolves around that. And a system could be I'm setting up, an overhand right, a head kick, and an MMA and a blast double, and you're kind of flipping between each of those with if then statements being generated simultaneously as you navigate between each
Yeah.
across different planes. So you have that, and then it's like, what type of enclosure do I have, or what are the constraints? Is it a circular cage? Is it a square cage? Is it a octagon, hexagon?
How big the
Uh,
cage is, how small it
yeah, how
is.
exactly? What does this? This is a new one actually that I'm just remembering because I was telling a story about an amateur fight where this maybe will be another topic. One of the first times I realized I have the capacity to feel bad for my opponent in a fight. But
Mhm.
I body kicked this guy during my amateur career, and he hid behind the ref.
Oh,
And I'm like, oh man, the ref is an obstacle in some cases. His job is not to be, but
yeah. That's
it's like,
interesting. I've
okay,
never thought about that.
yeah, people like, so like using everything about your environment to your advantage. Accounting for, do I have a guy who historically fence grabs, or grabs gloves or grabs
Right.
shorts? Um, how do you use the area? Even things as subtle as, so you have center cage or a mat control, and
Hmm.
then controlling that the outer perimeter, or the border of the cage in essence. Uh, I have many out of pocket jokes that that I can throw, but
I
so it's
mean,
like,
go
how
ahead. There's no
I
rules
was
in this podcast.
oh, sweet. I was like, never quite sure. Like I have a filter until I'm given permission to step across it, but I'll
Yeah.
keep that in mind as I circle back. But so center control, border control, and where do you prefer to be, and what is the relationship between what you notice about your opponent's zone management, when they engage you, when they don't. Do they disengage straight backwards? Do they disengage in a circle? And if so, for how long before they re-engage, based on not just the size and maybe like where the ref is and if you're orthodox or southpaw, but like even how there's usually markings on a cage or a mat that kind of help you recognize, like, hey, you're going from the center to here's the outer edge of the center. There's if you ever watch the UFC, you see that they have a line that kind of it's like directly in the center, and
Yeah.
then there's a perimeter in between the center and the actual fence. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of used subconsciously to track like where you're at. Like, don't be too far behind that line if your back's against a cage, because it'll be easy to pin you and start knocking you out. Statistically, that's I believe this still lines up with data. Like, that's where like most knockouts are happening to the opponent whose back is facing the fence, who stays behind that line. So like
Oh, interesting. Okay.
and so like whether people know what the exact numbers are on that or not, like you have a general feel for when you sense you're a cornered animal,
Yeah.
and it changes how you engage or disengage.
Okay.
And
So
so
this is nerdy. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
go
you're gonna
for it, go
love
for it.
this, right? So there's a neuroscientist named Michael Graziano who I was reading about a while ago, and he's, I think, out of Princeton University, and he did a lot of research on parapersonal space, which I think is this like zone, almost like this bubble that people have around themselves, where if you get too close to me when we're in line at the bank, for example, you start to
Hmm.
get that like get out of my space, that kind of feeling.
Yeah.
And this discussion reminds me of a lot of like the stuff that he talks about in his books and the podcasts and stuff that I've listened to him, where it's like there's that zone of like anxiety that people get when you get too close to them in that zone. And from
Hmm.
his perspective, it's you have this space, this bubble of space around you that's kind of like the keep out zone. Like
Yep.
people are getting too close to that zone, strangers are getting too close, people that I'm more familiar with, that
Hmm.
zone, that bubble might shrink a little bit. Or my own personal comfort. For example, I'm a jiu-jitsu guy. So my grappling, I feel very comfortable with people this close to me. I feel very
Hmm.
comfortable with like personal, like if I'm in line and somebody bumps into me, I'll put my hand on their shoulder and be like, "Ah, it's okay, don't stress it." And for me, that's totally comfortable. But other people who don't grapple, that bubble wrap around them is maybe a little bit bigger, that keep away zone. And so anyway, that just sort of a little aside, but it reminded me a lot of what he talks about with that parapersonal space and that kind of keep away zone, and how comfortable we are letting somebody get in this range or that range. So maybe for strikers, that zone might be a little bit longer, or you know,
That's I'm gonna write that down because that with acknowledging that there's an established field of study that addresses the qualia or the feel of that. A, you're in my bubble.
yeah,
It if it's if there's a baseline like evolutionary biological basis for that, or within whatever field of or subfield of psychology would address specifically that in its utility. If it exists simply as a product of existing as a human being,
mm-hmm.
then it's present and has an effect on competition dynamics, and it can be weaponized. It can be resourced. It's a tool,
Yeah,
uh, and so there's likely you know and it also likely reflect the size and even sensitivity, right? You could have a small bubble with low sensitivity, high bubble with high sensitivity. I'm assuming just like a big bubble,
yeah,
however it's shaped as your brain, your homunculus, like your brain's like perception of self, uh, whatever it believes about you as a person and your security, front facing, side facing, back facing,
well, that's
based on
kind of
injury.
the other line of research that he goes into is a part of schema theory where, like, I'm not educated in this stuff, so I'm probably gonna screw it up explaining it. But he talks. One of the other things he talks a lot about is so you have this sort of internal model of your body schema. This is how long my arms are and what my body can do. I can reach here, I can reach there. You have that personal bubble wrap around. It's like this is my keep away space. You can get close, you can get far. And then he talks a lot about like having like your consciousness having um you know what I can't explain this well, but
No,
his name is Michael Graziano.
Michael
If
Grazia
you
outread it.
Yeah,
No, I mean, I think the cool thing about these formats is it really is just an opportunity to like just share ideas, and however
yeah,
far down the rabbit hole we can go. If there's like, hey, let's pause. You know, I mean, don't leave me hanging in the abyss. Come back and
yeah,
let's continue the journey together. But Michael Graziano.
yep. And so maybe what you were talking about those zones in mixed martial arts. Maybe the zone of somebody who's like a Muay Thai artist, might be totally different than somebody who's a wrestler or a jiu-jitsu person, because a jiu-jitsu person or a wrestler feels so much more comfortable with somebody being this close to you because you're grabbing them. And maybe somebody who is somebody Muay Thai specialist might feel a little bit further away. There's still clinch work, but maybe they're more comfortable in that bubble zone of being a little further away, and that sort of keep away space is a different range where they feel comfortable. Um, which again, not to talk too much in the podcast, because this is me trying to talk to you about your ideas, but it you're talking about the zone in mixed martial arts, the different zones kind of reminded me of that. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's I think it's great that you even brought this idea up because this is I can actively play with this
I knew
as a
you'd be
student.
into it.
Yes, no, I'm really excited. I mean, I'm honored. I have this project that I'm continuing to build for martial artists to just help with more precise game planning over the course of weeks, months, years, for their career based on where they want to go. And these dynamics, I don't think they're often voiced in ways that can be reduced to curriculum for youth, teen, adults, and then elite professionals. You know, I told you about this multi-dimensional framework, and I think, for today's podcast, it goes deep. I wouldn't even, I'd be lying to you if I said I have embodied 10 spatial dimensions of martial arts, just martial arts training, let alone competing in that way. Like I don't entirely understand it as it has been unpacked over the course of these years, but I think an entry point for it would be to start at like dimension zero, like a hypothetical zeroth dimension, and a single point of indeterminate size. It's make sure I get this. I want to get this completely right, because this will be something I think I'd actually be excited to hear your feedback on how you could take this definition and some of the examples and play around with your experience in competition, in training, and even observing your athletes develop as a coach. Um, so this 10-dimensional model is actually inspired by, I forget the gentleman's name, but you can find him on YouTube. He has a channel and individual videos going into detail on each dimension, and then a movie video that just combines all 10 dimensions into a just a fun like 90-minute thing you can watch and play
Is
around
it
with.
is it kind of like, so what you're describing, is it sort of like if you had a song and then you separate all the different instruments into separate tracks and then you put them all together into the entire song? Is that kind of the 10-dimensional thing that you're talking about? Like,
Man,
or
that's
like a piece of cake where you have like the icing and then I'm going to separate the icing and then the jelly filling and the whatever. Like, is that sort
I
of what
think
you're
I
describing?
think yes, but I think that exists inside of the framework of what I'm about to currently unpack. It's so we'll like dimension zero is basically the starting and end point. And I realized this yesterday after kind of reading through it again and then meditating, just like watching what does my brain do with the information that's it's been presented with. I try to play around with both. Like, if I'm studying coursework, that's when I'm taking a test, I kind of have to, well, rather when you're doing maybe like worksheet exercises, or case studies, you have to engage with the stuff. You have to like flex your brain consciously. But there's
Yeah.
also, I think there's utility sometimes. Like I'm presented with new information, or I'm presented with old information, and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to be still and listen to the dialogue that happens in response, given my present experience. Right, I have more life experience to account for the details explained. And so, like dimension zero is the point. It's indeterminate size, all possible values. So here's the perceptual shift. If you could take yourself into this space, whatever image you would like to create, whatever setting, whatever feel, you are viewing any moment, position, technique, or thought as a singularity of pure potential before it differentiates and before action, right? It's the unmanifest seed from which all possibilities emerge. So, from a martial arts mastery standpoint, you think about like a white belt. We've talked about you've seen the sheet and how I kind of organize development across, from white all the way down to black belt. And so at white belt, the movement stage before you go into technique, tactics, and systems, uh, you have this space where you're kind of discovering the field. If you're a grappler, you're like, okay, like, yeah, I've heard of arm bars, I've heard of a berimbolo roll. I understand passing guard. There are all these terms, but I also see people assuming positions for each of the, like my body has to morph into a shape and stay there for this long unless this happen. So you have to understand simply how to organize your body on repetition into something that looks like grappling,
Uh,
and not baseball or striking or something.
okay. So you're saying like somebody comes into the sport, they have an idea of what the sport is, rough idea. I know what grappling is. I'm going to grab somebody and we're going to roll around on the ground. And then you gradually shape that into the movements that then eventually turn into advanced grappling. Is that kind of,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Right. You have to have a body that can effectively express positions in sequence that give rise to chokes, arm locks, ankle locks, takedowns, stand ups, whatever.
okay,
And it doesn't have to be that complex, but that's just it's a layer of what's happening across like motor skill acquisition. You have like stage one is it's an acquisition stage. Like everything is awkward. You're like that. Like you're not thinking. Most people, even sports scientists, aren't thinking like, okay, humerus internally rotates. Thumbs pointed down, hip is
right.
hinging. These muscle groups and like they're not thinking that, but that's what's happening. Your brain even without formal language, has to fire, from a, just from a neurological standpoint, it's to figure out, okay, like, where do I fire? And is it a low or high threshold motor? Is it it's like a fine motor skill that requires like low threshold motor units, or is it a high threshold motor unit type thing where I have to be super explosive and strong? And do I have to do it again? And what do I have to account for, to not get hurt or to not fail? And so that's like the first that 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 that's what I consider the discovery space or stage of development. And at dimension zero, it's like, an example in grappling would just be like the initial ready stance, just a point of balanced alert potential. So like every touch and every initial contact is boom. What are all possible things that could happen from here, given the position I'm in? Get like, where am I relaxed? Where am I engaged? Where are they relaxed? Where are they engaged? And what is our orientation? Is my center of mass lower or higher than theirs? Am I staggered or square? Are they staggered or square? Are there people close or far away to me? Am I in the center? All these. How tired am I?
So this is
Uh,
all like the like this is obviously not what's going through somebody's head in that moment, but just from an outside perspective, if you were going to map like if I'm watching a student and I wanted to make a map or a diagram of what's happening, that conversation that they're having in that moment, then you have that
hmm
one point, which is that like 0 point, and
hmm
then if they lean forward, this happens. If they lean backwards, this happens. Here's all the variables. The cage is over here. They're on slippery mats. They're not on slippery mats.
Yep.
This person has 2 years of experience and they're 23 years old and they're athletic. This person has 20 years experience and they're 45 years old and their athleticism is diminishing. And so, like you're talking about, taking that pause, drop of water in space, and making a map out of all the possibilities in that moment.
Exactly. And
Okay.
this is and I'm sure what you're realizing, like, so we still have like dimension 1 through 10 to go through after all of that, but
Yeah.
you can likely see how dimension zero is both the starting and end point, because you account for, if one could account for every point at which anything could happen feasibly within your skill sets and your physical constraints, and same thing, and whatever is happening with the, orientation between you and your opponent. It's it that is the unified field, point by point by point by point. But at dimension zero, or in this case a white belt at dimension zero can only consciously engage with each point one frame, or like 1 second at a time. It's like frame by frame, but the association between each frame is, they're just like, I'm just here right now, and
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty around each.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, and that's why I related it to, in motor skill or motor learning. Stage one is just acquisition. You're just acquiring the skill. You haven't yet hit stage two, where you have an association of individual and integrated movements as they relate to tactical integration of individual skill sets. And it certainly has not become stage three autonomous, where you are just unconsciously competent. You like, like someone shoots on you and reflexively, you understand, like match them with your hips if you're more of a wrestling sprawl and spin type of person, or yield to it. So in sports science terms, for any of these listeners, you might have like an overcoming isometric where you extend and pop your hips as they shoot in on you, and you match the power and strength of their shot with the power and strength of your sprawl and your whizzer or your overhook, and then you engage in maybe more strength play from there to get to get out of it and reshot, or to just keep the fight standing. And then on the other end, maybe you're more of a maximum efficiency and minimum effort type of person, and they shoot and you do some combination of funk scramble cut a corner. It's like they shoot and you kind of disappear like a ghost, and you're on their back. I'm sure
Yeah.
this sounds very much like you.
Well,
Or
me is just getting double legged and then trying to get back up.
no, that's I thought that you're not fooling me. I've gone with you I've gone with you enough to know that shooting in on you is a Pandora's box of scrambles into leg exchanges where I recognize my ankle was toast before the match started.
Well, we'll let the listeners think that for the time being to be charitable to me, but I appreciate you, Will. um, so okay, so this is good. So I think then what I'm seeing is that the ultimate goal for this is to, like, there's always going to be uncertainty in something like this, right? Because you're creating a model, and because humans are complex and environment is complex and all these moving parts, there's an incalculable amount of variables in the experience of a fight, a grappling scenario, whatever. So what you're talking about is trying to make as much of a map as possible while maybe leaving room for the natural uncertainty that's always going to happen, even if you have, so much experience and you have such a tight game plan and you've trained things to the point where they're pretty predictable and they're pretty able, you can prepare for most of these things. There's still always a question mark here and there. And so in your model that you're working towards with this, how do you factor in that kind of uncertainty that's just never going to go away? Like, is there a way that you factor in, like, okay, when we're using this kind of model for beginners, there's a lot of uncertainty. As you gain more experience, some of that uncertainty goes away, or it morphs into, you're learning a new skill set, and then all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of uncertainty again. Like, what does that look like in your unified theory model?
Yeah, so I think the cool thing is that there's a quote that I'm sure it's not like a famous quote, but it's something often spoken in the martial arts, and I would say just sport community. When you have a student teacher relationship,
Mm-hmm.
and this is for all students, by the way, who are, whether you're new to martial arts or new to any domain, and like maybe you haven't experienced genuine trust in a mentor or someone that has done their homework on the theory, on the theoretical end, and it has also lived it out. Josh, I think you're a great example of this. Of just since 20, I think it was 2017 when we first, no, not 20, 2019, I think we first met. This is when I was interning with Mike, and
Oh
I
yeah,
came out to
yeah.
Philly to visit. And I remember shortly after that visit, you had sent me in essence a piece of the working model. As I'm assuming you and Angie were transitioning into your own space with the jiu-jitsu company, and
Yeah,
you
a
were
couple
just,
years later, yeah.
yeah. And so uh, you're playing around with ideas, pen and paper or on a laptop. You're taking notes in document form, and you're tracking progress like a scientist, and you're actively coaching and actively competing to ensure that like it's tangible, and not
Yeah.
just for you, but you're also doing the same thing for others. And so once as a student, that's something you should be looking for when searching for a martial arts facility, is a coach who truly is doing their due diligence. They don't have to be a world champion in any domain, but I think the champion's mindset, this is something actually I talked to my dad last night for a bit. Watching a person who's willing to recreate themselves after adversity,
Hmm.
and come back and find success. And again, it doesn't have, success is relative to the person and their ambitions and I guess just their willingness, up to a certain point, but you know, that right, that is a champion, and what you want in a coach is someone who can walk the path with you as a student
Yeah.
while also leading from ahead, and that's so, I say all that because when you're new to a class and you've been running through different techniques over and over again and you're having trouble kind of connecting dots, it's like, okay, we're on our feet, now we're on the floor, I'm on top, we're on bottom, and you're trying to understand the field and, like what, like, oh, it feels weird to do an arm bar or a triangle, or it feels weird to control, to pass guard in this way versus that way,
Yeah.
right? Like there's a clear direction that the coach is organizing everyone's development in, and trusting that process is important. And you can trust someone like Josh, like a Mike Israel. I'd like to think myself,
Yeah.
when it's time for me to really hit the scene as a full time coach, that we have something mapped, something that's dense and sound enough to run on repetition over the course of, and chop up and organize over the course of the year, uh, that, like, yes, ask questions, but be all right with the uncertainty that the learning process lends to. This is something, I know Huberman was famous. He's not the first person who had said this, but he had talked about like the feel, again, like the quality of learning, and how like that agitation you have when you're like, oh, I'm trying to position my body, or you're doing a composition or a math or whatever subject, and you're trying to grasp like the principles in it. It doesn't feel good necessarily, maybe, especially if, like, physical pain is aversive to you more so than others, or like critical thinking maybe is like, it's tough, it hurts. That's learning. That is the a piece of the feel of learning, and the uncertainty that comes with it, again, can be, you don't have, it doesn't have to be associated with, a lack of trust or a lack of direction, because it is really just part of the process. And kind of closing on that point, a black belt within this model at dimension zero, um, you know there's profound stillness and centeredness from which all action and wisdom arise. So it's like the point of ultimate integration and origin. There's enough time spent in the trenches, and exploring nearly every variation of situations that could happen in a given position, and configuration, um, and enough trust in your ability to kind of just like let go of preconceived notions of what should happen next, because you have enough options to at least funnel it back to a basic execution of your A game. The example could just be, someone shoots on me regardless of what position I'm in, like maybe they shoot on me with a double versus a single leg, straight on versus at an angle or behind me, right? Like the rules kind of shift, but they all circle, like they're all going to circle back to, I need to orient myself in a way that provides avenues for the moves that I am most comfortable with, which could just be, now that I've sprawled and overcome their force with my sprawl and my whizzer, or whatever type of posture, and again, and even the terms that I'm using, like wizard could, like wizards, where you overhook someone and kind of like lock their gripping arm in with your arm, and into your waist. Like there are many ways to achieve that effect, right? Like sprawling and wizarding or locking is simply the act of using overcoming isometric forces to stop your opponent from doing what they wanted to do, versus yielding, where you are giving and repurposing that energy and momentum for something that, again, provides an avenue for you to execute what you're most comfortable with, right? Counter takedown or sprawl and scramble into your best position, back take, top mount, uh, 50-50 saddle, whatever else.
So
And so,
this, sorry,
no,
sorry to
no,
interrupt
no,
you,
that's,
but I think what I, so this is So one of the things I know about you that I think is so interesting and that I respect a lot about you is that you're a mixed martial artist and you've been doing this for a long time, but in your language, like I used to do traditional martial arts like kung fu styles and stuff like that in the late 90s
Heck,
and early 2000s. And in your language, I detect a lot of like some of the same, like, yielding, and the way that you talk about certain things in combat sport reminds me of the language used in traditional martial arts. And I know that that's part of your own practice is doing some like karate styles,
hmm
and maybe some traditional jiu-jitsu styles. And like, so I think what is so interesting to me is that that's rare, I think, for mixed martial artists, because usually there's like, okay, we do combat sports and the traditional stuff is it's not real, blah blah blah. And so there's sort of a disrespect of that stuff. But with you, I see that you integrate ideas from your traditional martial arts experience, which is an ongoing practice for you. It's not like something you used to do and then you moved on from it. It's still an active part of what you're doing. And so I think what's so fascinating is that I see that fingerprint from traditional martial arts on how you describe and think about mixed martial arts. And so I guess I've been meaning to ask you, like, what are the things that you can glean from traditional martial arts that, like, if you're a mixed martial arts fighter, then you have limited training time per day. And so for you, there must be something really valuable about your traditional martial arts practice for you to keep on doing it, given that you have limited training time. So, what are some of those things that you find valuable in your traditional martial arts practice, that kind of keep you taking that training time and spending it there?
So yeah, like three things come to mind. So the first part of it, I'll credit. So judo, I think was the first tradition, like Japanese traditional martial art that I trained, and I'll actually have to credit was it Randy Russell Sensei back in Missouri. He's a seventh degree with Minmo Judo. He introduced himself to the facility I was training at during my time on Team USA for the IMAF championships. Uh, and so we had like a group of like 3 to 5 MMA fighters who were interested enough in judo to make it worth his time, and he
Mm-hmm.
ran us through classes, and it was honestly, I did not understand it. Uh, I showed up because in my gut, I suppose at the time, I was 21 to 23. I knew there was something valuable about it. This was during a shift in the industry when like women's MMA had gained popularity, and my first was like my first brush with judo was actually as a fan of St. Pierre when he debuted in the UFC against Karo Parisian, and Parisian was
Yeah.
just like a world class judoka. And I remember like up until St. Pierre started fighting for like title matches,
Mm-hmm.
I was shocked at how much trouble Parisian gave him, and
Yeah.
so like that, but it never went much further than that. Like I never studied him extensively. Uh, and then Ronda Rousey hit the scene, as like the champion of female mixed martial arts going into the UFC, and I never seen someone just just dominate somebody in the way that she did in the sport. Just throw armbar,
Yeah.
and yeah, I remember for a lot of male mixed martial arts at the time, I think they couldn't really grasp how impressive it was for another human being to be thrown feet to back and then elbow hyperextended against their will. It's like I don't care who you
Over and
are,
over and
like
over again.
over and over again.
Yeah.
It's like it's coming and it's still being done at the highest level all the way up to a belt. Like that's really impressive. I challenge any person just walking down the street to like cordially make eye contact with a stranger and like shake their hand and say, "Hey, I would love to just like for 3 minutes just attempt to throw you against your will and see how it goes." Like like not actual altercation, but like that's not easy, or walk into a martial arts gym and simply throw someone who does not want to be thrown.
Yeah.
No experience at all. Like this is before even traditional martial arts experience. So like that was the first part. It was like, okay, what was that? And then moving here to Michigan and finding finding the martial arts community that I've built over the last almost year now. Japanese martial arts training center has by far been the greatest traditional experience I've had. And so with judo, Suino Sensei, Nicholas Suino Sensei. He's I believe he's also a seventh degree in judo. I could like Suino, don't crucify me if if I get this wrong. But his speech, he's also a lawyer, so like his like he has a refined speech and presence as he communicates his understanding of the judo maxims. The one at the
Okay.
top is maximum efficiency, minimal effort. So I'm like, well, what does that mean in real time practice as a full contact mixed martial artist, and that took me back into the sports science development space where I'm like, okay, with motor learning, what happens across the three stages? Again, for listeners, acquisition, stage one, associative, stage two, and then autonomous, or like not even thinking about a stage three, right? And you can look at the fitness spectrum, uh, not necessarily on ground level with like the metabolic demands, like is it high intensity or low intensity, and then going from like aerobic to anaerobic from there. But the practice itself, is it passive and static? Is it active? Or is it active and dynamic as far as training goes? And this is where we get into an interesting conversation, the current domain on like how to properly train combat athletes. And
Right.
so, we look at static drills. I'm like, okay, what is happening during the static drills that are so popular in traditional training? And it's not that this is, you know, Suino actually he does an amazing job at describing what's happening from his progression of static to active to dynamic drilling before we get into free play. And this is something that I'm just not putting into words again. I remember referencing it when I was trying to teach a group of students back in like during quarantine. Um, Static or passive drilling, and it's a really safe and effective way to cooperatively understand what it feels like. Give me 1 second. I am going to switch my mic so I can plug my phone in. But
Sure.
what it feels like for for a successful technique to be executed aligning with the judo maxims. And so before you just say slap and bump and go after it, right? There's like a double leg feels a certain way. Can you still hear me, by the way?
Yeah, yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
Yep.
So like a double leg feels a certain way versus a single leg versus a hip throw, or a forward throw where you take someone forward for them versus a backward throw like a Kouchi or Ouchi guard where you're like tripping them and pushing them backwards. Or like an Osotogari, a major outer reap where you're reaping their outer leg and pushing them to make them fall on their back away from you. Right.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
all of
a
those.
foot sweep is like very much like that, where and there's different types of foot sweeps, but like just generic that foot sweep of okay, your foot unplugs from the ground, you're stepping as your weight shifts. I gently
Mhm.
guide your foot out of the way, you fall down.
Yes.
To me, that stands out as something that has such a distinct feel on both
Yes.
sides when it's done when it's done well. It just feels like effortless, efficient. You almost want to laugh when you get foot swept like that because you're just like,
Oh
that
yeah.
felt so silly. And then that
It,
that's that to me sort of sums up what you're saying really well, in that there is a very specific feel to something like a foot sweep in judo when it's executed beautifully.
exactly. And rather than, so you can show since foot sweeps. This is a great example, right? Because I think foot sweeps are still underappreciated in the broader pop martial arts field. Uh, since you can look at film, whether it's Olympic judo, Olympic wrestling, MMA, what ADCC, IBJJF, you see techniques happen, right? You see two people agree to disagree, right? Meaning like I'm not just gonna let you do something, and then
Yeah,
you watch a foot sweep happen. It's like okay, it literally just happened. Pause, rewind, start at the moment of the entry, right? And then the initial point of contact, and then what is happening with the off balance and the series of positional sequences that creates the moment of throw and fall and then claim sub or top mount from, or like a top pin from there. Like, how is it possible leveraging your understand, literally leveraging your understanding of physics to make someone fall to the floor like this with an entry, a grip, an off balance, and then a throw and finish. And if you can slow it down enough and like I can't remember I can't remember the channel that I caught this on, but like there's nothing wrong with training choreography to get your body familiar with what that feels like. It doesn't take that long. You just need both partners to understand this is what it feels like for A person to offensively execute, and this is what it feels like for B person to defensively receive. Right? I
Yeah.
give, you receive. It's cooperative, and that's like Japanese martial arts center is. It's not a competition school. Um, so on top of the value that I hope is already being provided in explaining the process of static all the way up to active and dynamic training for real life, like super, almost like Dragon Ball Z level technical execution, training at JMAC, like training traditional martial arts, it also is a really good way to kind of taper off at the end of the week. That's how I'm currently plugging it into my training, especially while I'm in training camp for MMA. You know, the competition training day for MMA kind of caps off at Thursday. So I have Sunday through Thursday to start relatively broad with MMA development. We have boxing, jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, kickboxing, and some wrestling stuff. So I can start broad there and funnel that into more. And we even have a leg locks class now, super cool.
Nice.
So it all funnels into Thursday where it's competition grappling and then competition striking. Right, so I get to put it all together after starting broad and then getting specific, and then to recover through the weekend, instead of just training MMA hard again, and since I'm already getting general like my foundational pillars of mixed martial arts early in the week, I have space to just move around cooperatively with partners and get a lot of static work, or even before then, like a lot of just movement based training. Like I can't remember what the floor and mat the Japanese term for like floor and mat drills are called. Where it gets like uchikomi. Maybe this is uchikomi. Um, don't quote me on that. But so you get a lot of like, hey, this is how to move your body like a traditional martial artist on your own. Here are the exercises. Like if
Yeah, I
you're in
think
the
the
weight room,
uchikomi are like the fit-ins, right? Where you do
the
like
fit ins.
the
Yeah,
entry for the throw, the entry for the
gotcha.
throw,
Yeah,
the
it's like
entry. Yeah.
gotcha. Uh, oh man, it's gonna bother me. Oh well. But it but you get a lot of those foundational drills, then your static work, and then you get a smooth bridge to and I'll quote Sweet Sensei on this, more recalcitrant play where your opponent is not going to just let you achieve the technique. So it's like, okay, now that they are resisting in this plane, if we circle back to that term, it's like, okay, so first there's pure cooperation. I can off balance them for a Seonage throw, right? A one arm shoulder throw, right?
Right.
If they're 100% cooperative with me in a square stance, this is what it feels like. Now I know that. Okay, so what happens when they're in their staggered fight stance and they clamp down versus plant their foot backward versus lean to one side, right? That's the space, the infinite vector space that we're talking about where
Yeah, all the question marks.
exactly. And yes, there's a lot of uncertainty there, but again, if you reference, hey, this is happening at the highest level, a shoulder throw, a hip throw, a trip, a foot sweep, a double leg, whatever, now now you understand how big the field is and how I mean, like it's difficult if you have an athletic person and a competent person to get them to do what you want until you circle around to a higher, say, dimensional understanding of the sport, and you recognize how to use their reactions, like their unconscious reactions, or their game, their conscious tactical execution of their preferred counters or offensive maneuvers, and repurpose them for your own offense. Now we're having a different conversation. Like, oh, they did this. Great. I'm familiar with that response, and I know how to repurpose it for this move or chain it to my B game and then circle back to my A game.
Yeah, and one thing, in the way that you're describing this, like when you're talking about repetition, like rote repetition, where there's not resistance, and we're just doing, uchikomis, or maybe you're practicing the technique of seonagi over and over and over again with a training partner. Like it, what I'm not hearing from you that is I like a lot is that you're not saying anything about doing the perfect technique over and over and over again for hundreds of repetitions. Like what I'm hearing you say is that you're looking for the feel of what an effortless seonagi feels like.
Yep.
But if I'm 5'7" and you're 6'1", or you're 6'1" and I'm 6'5", or I'm wider or shorter or taller or jacked or whatever, like we're not looking for repetition of the exact perfect, my wrist has to be turned 19.7 degrees every single time towards the harvest moon during the summer solstice. Like, it's
Yeah.
just, okay, I want to get that feeling of effortlessness. And I think maybe behind that, what I'm going to maybe speculate a little bit
Go
is
for it.
that in these kind of repetitions, what you're looking for are some stable points that have to happen mechanically for the thing to be effortless. But it's not that it's this overly prescriptive thing where every small joint angle has to be mapped out perfectly. It's that, okay, I have to get my back to face your chest. I have to get my hips lower than your hips. I have to load your center of gravity over my shoulder or over my mid back so that your feet unplug from the floor. These are stable
Hmm.
points. The rest of it, there's wiggle room. But as long as I do some of these stable points, back to chest, lower center of gravity, off balance you forward, then the rest of it, there's wiggle room for different body types, or for, I didn't get a lot of
Exactly.
sleep last night, so I'm sloppier, or I got a lot of sleep and I feel great, so I'm more crisp. Like it's not this overly prescriptive thing. And then it also doesn't sound like you're talking about spending hours upon hours of doing thousands of reps of the same thing over and over again. It
Hmm.
sounds to me like you're, okay, I'm looking for the feeling of effortlessness. I'm going to do it enough where I can kind of get comfortable with that feeling, and then I'm going to build up into some sort of live work. Is that sort of accurate?
Man, that's spot on. And that's, the important thing to distinguish is like the intent for someone's training. Like if your goal is to compete, like getting from point A to point B is the most important thing, right? So like if doing so consistently injures like you or your partner in training, or if you're just always getting hurt in competition, then yeah, technical improvements may be something you circle back to. But or it could also be just like a physical capacity thing. It's like, man, maybe you are overtraining in the sports domain, and undertraining in your physical conditioning domain, like a bit more joint stability and strength, and flexibility and reactiveness could assist your approach to executing these techniques. um, but the other thing that flagged, or that came to mind when you're talking about getting reps, was like the practice as an entirety. Like going live is a series of repetitions. You think
Yeah.
about a weight room, like you can count your workout in terms of sets and number of repetitions done with a certain weight, or you could also think about sets with a given weight or intensity for a specified duration, and that's reps of a certain duration done on, for however long, for whatever given intent, to train a specific metabolic system that will then yield, like more long-term endurance, or more power, in a specific direction from certain muscle groups. And the same thing's happening, like martial arts is physical exercise. You have to move your body in ways that are either aerobic or anaerobic, that are either supported by long endurance, like I need oxygen to keep this thing going, or it's like, I have to like bite down and get really gritty. I might have a little bit of explosion for a bit, and then I'm gonna have to bear down, and I might get a little bit of a pump. But it's energy metabolism expressed as art.
Right.
And so like going live is getting reps done, um, getting enough static reps to have a general idea of how it feels, and then transition through active and dynamic drills to smooth it out a little bit, so that you feel comfortable doing it as many times as you can in real time, it is the ultimate goal, right? The more time you could spend in free form, in randori or free practice, ideally the better.
Yeah.
But if your free practice isn't yielding results, then you circle back, and that's what a good practice is. Like, make sure everyone's bodies and minds are prepared to do the damn thing, and then smooth out wrinkles here and there. You have everything from white to upper belt, and you just everyone in class has to accept that they're gonna move at the pace that they do, given what they bring in genetically, how they prefer to learn, how fast they learn, how strong or whatever they are, how nimble, how often they show up, all these things.
Yeah.
Um, I had one more detail on that, but I'll go ahead and pause. I think that's a I don't I'm like does that sound I mean does that sound like it's tracking with you?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And I think, over the last maybe 10 minutes or so, we talked a little bit about your practice of traditional martial arts. Specifically, in this case, it was focused on judo. And then we talked
Hmm.
a little bit about repetition, with the focus being on getting the feeling of that judo maxim of effortless execution. And then we talked a little bit just now about like the relationship between, you know, repetition for the sake of getting that effortless feeling, and then
Hmm.
also the relationship between that and how that plugs into live work, and then how important it is to spend a lot of time doing live work, so that, because that's what an actual sporting event feels like, or an actual whatever you're preparing for, MMA event. And then that reminds me of kind of what we started off with, which was Gamma, which is sort of a lower stakes version of mixed martial arts that gives you repetitions of the experience of a mixed martial arts fight without the classic cost of getting experience doing like full on mixed martial arts fights, where your body gets tore up pretty good. Not that this is gentle, but like, if you're not doing knees to the head and there's certain limits on what you can do, you're still getting repetitions of what it's like to be in MMA fights, especially if you're doing a tournament format, which I think you're saying Gamma is. Um,
Hmm.
but without that cost that chews you up in the long term.
Yeah, so that's and I just remember the point that I forgot is a bridge into the second reason why I continue to circle back to traditional martial arts training. So like the other distinction that I was going to make for training development was like if you're a traditional martial artist who is doing the do practice as opposed to the jitsu side, so in Japanese terms, it just means like you are seriously just practicing for inner personal development, mutual welfare. You're not ever gonna fight. You're never gonna do like a points based tournament or full contact MMA fight, but you want to embody the practice itself. Have the structure that reflects something warlike. Then that is a different that's a different conversation. If you're competing for a federation that's looking for specific joint angles, you have, like pause during a form and someone comes up with a protractor or goniometer and they're like, you're 1 degree off. Sorry, you don't get your
Yeah,
stripe this year. So there's that, but yeah, as far as its translation to, if we circle back to full contact MMA or just like mainstream grappling, it's a bit of a stretch to say that that degree of precision is necessary for pertinent carryover to competitive sports. But that said, while the school that I train at is not a competition school, and so they give some attention to that. But again, we only have you have an hour to get to the point where you can go live. So all of the senseis are just like, listen, like you, if it were so easy to hit the perfect joint angles and execute the perfect throw every single time, we would market that after your first class you are a black belt, congratulations, like, and then you'd
yeah,
have no students. So like you have to acknowledge that that process is there. Whether or not you desire or even care about all this, all the finite details, of executing a technique, like it's still you're going to have to circle back to the basics again. But in karate, the thing that I'm enjoying most now, I'm preparing a post and I have a video of the entire class doing one of the forms, uh, one of the forms that I'm just not familiar with it at all. Like the karate class, it's a Goju-ryu,
Hmm.
hard soft style, and it's like really traditional and purely kata based. Um, and so yeah, all positions are like super important, like foot turned at like 30. I think they like it's like one of the collaborators is in Japan, so at least once a week, like we're on Zoom with the Japanese instructor by himself or with his class as we're learning directly from here, and then that information is shuttled into the rest of the program as the senseis continue to teach everyone. The thing that I enjoy about that, so first and foremost, and I'll circle back to the first point, it's a great way to like actively deload after a high intensity week of training, right? I'm still
Okay.
moving my body like a martial artist, but there's flexibility, like even in the warm ups, just getting a really good stretch, doing a lot of great mobility. It takes all of like 5 to 10 minutes to run through that. That's I'm perfectly fine with that if I get to go into the stuff that will make me a better karate or judo fighter afterward. And in addition, some of the dynamic or active and dynamic drills, like specific to judo or karate, they have some unique features like helping you with mind body awareness, connecting to individual joints and their integration with different techniques in ways that for me have yielded like just relaxation or like a awareness of even tension and anxiety in certain positions. Like I'm training karate and realizing that like there are certain positions that like I'm associating like, oh God, I'm about to get hit and I'm overly tense and I'm actually stealing my own power from myself. Uh,
Oh, okay.
so like just working, having someone come through and be like, hey, like I understand that you have a lot of power, but you'd have a lot more if you weren't holding on to whatever it is that's like stopping you from just assuming, an ideal resting position for this form before we go into it. Like you're going to be burnt out and out of position before we get halfway through the kata. And
So this is
the
interesting because it's like,
yeah,
so I'm sorry to cut you off again.
no worries, go for it.
But so I think when you were talking about using it kind of as a deload, then my
Hmm.
my first thought was like, okay, well, so what are like, so you could probably just as easily do shadow boxing, shadow
Precisely.
grappling, shadow MMA fighting, but you're specifically doing kata, which is a very different thing than shadow fighting, because with shadow fighting you know you're not doing the same movements over and over and over again. You might throw a punch and then imagine that somebody throws a punch at you and you slip it. And then the next time you do it, you might slip to the other side, or you might level change and double leg. And so there's a certain amount of unpredictability that happens in shadow fighting or shadow grappling that doesn't happen in kata. So then I was going to ask, well, then if you're choosing to spend your time doing kata, there must be some features to kata that are unique that you find valuable. And so I think you
Yeah.
kind of touched on that with maybe the mind body connection stuff and the internal sensation and relaxing in certain positions.
So there's the other features that I would say, and now I'm circling back. Like I didn't even know kata was a term used in judo, right? So they're like judo katas, both standing and for a ground or newaza. And so I'm like, what is kata? Like that was the first question I had even before I moved here to Michigan. 'Cause I trained karate for a local school in my hometown. The instructor combined it with taekwondo and kickboxing and aikido, and so going through them, there's an immense focus as well, right? Feeling that focus and concentration that gets shuttled into more free form. In the case of my past dojo, free form kickboxing practice, where for me, I don't know if I'm speaking for everyone who's trained traditional martial arts, but just being in the community, one thing that I notice as a standout relative to like wrestling teams I've been a part of or other sports minus the top performers, like the elite ones, is just a sense of presence and sharp focus that they have. Like they're like nothing distracts them from the objective. Like if the objective is to execute as near perfect technique on repetition for however long the coach says to do it, they just abide as the technique with the directions for as long as it takes. Even as you start to you acknowledge, okay, my breathing is heavy, my heart is racing, I do feel a muscle burn, I'm sweating a lot. I sense other people through my peripheral vision, and as I hear the breathing in the room, and like, it starts to get more humid, everyone's slowing down. But I know that getting the most high quality repetitions is important. And now that I'm in this state, I will just continue to endure or suffer or whatever it is, because I was like that gives you a strategic advantage as well. If you're a person who for 10 minutes can execute, or even let's say in 5 minutes, you and your partner back and forth get 30 to 50 repetitions of a technique done. That's a big ask, by the way.
Yeah.
Versus other students who in 5 minutes, maybe they do one or two and then they kind of bored and they talk about like, oh, where else could I go with this technique? Hey, did you hear about such and such the other day? So they get like, 5 to 15 done. Like the volume is so important, and obviously just getting more volume done can be achieved by many means, right? Just coaches being like hankering down on their students or whatever. But the soft approach that Kata provides uh, allows you to lean into a harder style of training in a way that, again, it's cooperative, both partners are in it, and it's sustainable for the body. I only exert myself with the speed and strength that I know my joints can handle and that I know my muscles can tolerate, as it reflects my ability to repeat that same cycle for ideally 4 to 6 weeks before pulling back on my entire program. That and the story that is contained within the kata. This is something that Tim Lynch
Yeah.
Sensei, he's also he so this gentleman, he actually moved away from kumite style training, jitsu style karate training, because he didn't mind taking a punch, but there weren't many people in his dojo that were like that, and so he was like, he needs to step away, and he focused all on kata. And there's, historically, a lot of these forms were again constrained by the culture, the time period, the technology, the anthropometry, of the warriors or the soldiers, in the military that practiced it. And if you learn the story, your brain, at least my brain, generates an image from above of, okay, what would it be like if I could extend my empathy and transfer this body into that story? Like there's a lot that happens, right? There's a like active, now you're doing active imagination while actively training, and you are living out a war story, in whatever sense. And then as your instructor fills in your knowledge gaps with stories of like why the form looks this specific way, whether it's like there was a form one day that they were throwing in around holidays. It was for women during a time period where villages could have been attacked, and so it's like, okay, you have a baby in one arm, you have to run, you have to flee the village, you have to not only worry about maybe fending off people with your free arm or your leg, but there are arrows flying as well. And so we have various objects in the house or on the streets that can protect you from flying arrows and your baby, and then still provide you with a way to fight people. So like you're,
Yeah.
you're you're not necessarily fighting people exactly the way you would with the kata, but it's like, hey, here's a general rule, right? If you're a woman during this time period and we're at war with this country and they're attacking the village, here's how they're attacking the village. Here's what you need to know about. Shape yourself like this so that you and your baby don't die. Or in this case, at least your baby doesn't die. You're not fatally injured.
So
I'm
there's
like, man,
almost
that's
like
a,
a, yeah. So there's,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. So
You're never interrupting.
thank you. Yeah. So it seems like then there's almost a theater aspect to it, right? Where
Mhm.
there's like, it's not just like, I was listening to a discussion with a guy named John Mackey and another guy named Scott Seaven, right, who were discussing skill acquisition, and there was one point that they, I don't know if I would call it an argument, but they kind of disagreed on, and they were talking about, I think Scott was saying that kata and doing a preset 1 2 3 jab cross hook, like those kind of combinations on pads are kind of
Mm-hmm.
equivalent to kata. And I
Mm-hmm.
think one missing piece of that wasn't that made that was not quite there was the story that you're talking about, and sort of the imagination and the theatrical part of it, where, for example, when I used to do traditional martial arts in the 90s, there was kind of that thing where, okay, this is a kung fu style, there's a praying mantis form, there's a little bit of imagery that you have in your head where you're like, hooking the arm like this and hooking the arm like that. And, there's the sensation of like putting yourself in the role of this animal or that animal and feeling sort of the vibe of that animal.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that theatrical aspect to it. And then like what you were saying about doing a kata that's like holding a baby when your village is getting attacked, and that's a whole like other, that's an entire world of theater that you're building right there.
Yeah.
And to me that kind of reminds me of, something I used to do in jiu-jitsu a lot when I was a blue belt. I always had my favorite grapplers, and Marcelo Garcia was one of my favorite grapplers. And when I would compete, I would watch a bunch of Marcelo Garcia footage, and I would pretend like, all right, I'm not pretending like I'm Marcelo Garcia, but like, I would get so psyched, and like, oh, maybe part of you is kind of pretending to be that grappler that you like. Or,
Yes.
when I was a little kid growing up skateboarding, I would watch like Ray Barbie, or I mean, this is like, the early 90s. I would watch like Bones Brigade or like certain famous skateboarders that were professionals, and I would watch them, and then I would go skate, and I would kind of pretend like I was them when I was skateboarding. And so there's, I think, the common theme that we're talking about with kata and imagination and, the animal kung fu forms, and, is sort of the same thing that a little kid growing up watching basketball might, have a poster of Michael Jordan, and then when they go play
Yes.
basketball, they stick their tongue out like him when they're dunking.
Mm-hmm.
And me as a skateboarder as a kid, imagining myself as Ray Barbie, and me as a blue belt, imagining myself as Marcelo Garcia. And so there's this like imagine this mental imagery and imagination, and your point about empathy, like extending that empathetic part of you to imagine yourself in the shoes of another person while you're doing something martial, seems to be the theme that kind of runs through all of these things that we're talking about.
Man, that so here's why it's, and I will by no means say like if a student, like future situation, right, 5 to 10 years down the road, I'm running my school and I'm talking about the unified field of martial arts reflected in our program and how there's an option for a traditional martial arts pathway, and how I do encourage non-traditionalists to still dip their toes in and even do the forms and everything. If an athlete says no, I'm not bashing them over the head with, with dogma to force them into a framework that doesn't really suit their preference. Like if the ambivalence, if the resistance toward those ideas, because maybe it's a bit too esoteric, maybe that's just not, like humans come into this world with presets. There's speaking with Mike and Minnow Hinzelman's during the holidays about like Ocean's 5 personality test, and how you have people who are just naturally going to score higher or lower on openness, and in whatever domain, in this case martial arts, they might that just they might be coming in with low trait openness and 10 years of like club, high school and college wrestling, and there's just a way to learn, and a type of culture that has and it's like strengthened that belief, and there's nothing wrong with that versus coming from the opposite end of the spectrum or any other angle, in so long as the ultimate goal is achieved, which is they can do the technique, they can keep themselves and their partner safe, and they can succeed in competition, right? That's the ultimate goal. uh but for me, like that, like leaving no stone unturned, uh I think there. So the example I will use as to why I think a active imagination is just a general practice for any type of endeavor can be useful, and then for martial arts in particular is, I remember I had a friend visit me in Texas a while back, and she uh she had never seen jujitsu, like aside from like maybe like social media, or I'm assuming like catching a fight here and there.
Mm-hmm.
And so she went to a jiu-jitsu tournament that I was helping some of the athletes coach at, and then went back and trained jujitsu for the first time. Like had never done it. She was kind of a natural athlete, you know. So like you have an athlete that comes in with like all the prerequisites for jujitsu. You know that they were like a gymnast. They've lifted weights, so they understand how to move their bodies slow and fast, and they're healthy enough to just trust their bodies to do the material because they know they can handle it.
Hmm.
All she did was watch the tournament, you know, like 2 or 3 matches, and then when it was time to go live for the first time, hit a textbook double leg. And her partner, you know, who had been training way longer, was like, are you a wrestler? Or did you wrestle? She's like, no, I just saw it happen at the tournament earlier today, and I remembered it, and I just did. I can't tell you how I did it, but I did it. And so I
Yeah,
think, you know, for people who have, you know, who have all that resting, but you know, that they're a seed ready to like germinate and blossom into a martial artist. You know, if they're primed for it, and you expose them to something that their brain can repurpose into something immediately on the mats, like yeah, like that's just their imagination shuttling in technique and tactics in real time. That's fast learning. You know,
yeah,
not everyone can do that, but you know, or can do that at that rate. But if even half of your students are getting 10 to 30% of that, you know, not at the expense of technical development and live training, I would say that's an awesome boost to productivity.
yeah.
So
So
that
maybe like if we have like a spectrum of somebody like that who has no experience grappling and they see somebody do a double leg and then maybe just somewhere in their brain they visualize themselves doing that and then they can do it. And then you have all the way on the other end of the spectrum, like there's all these shades of gray of like, okay, there's that person. Then there's the person who's like maybe throwing punches on pads, but they're visualizing the opponent, or they're
hmm
shadow grappling and they're visualizing to their best of their ability based on their experience a live opponent coming back at them when they're shadow boxing, shadow grappling. And then you
hmm
have like kata, which is like you have types of kata where people are maybe imagining that they're like a certain animal or something doing like a thing like a tiger form or something.
hmm
And then you have maybe further down that where you're imagining like bigger worlds of like, okay, I'm holding a baby, my village is on fire or whatever. Like there's then a whole like a bigger visualization world embedded in that. And so maybe that's kind of going back to that discussion that I was telling you about it between the guys who were talking about like kata kind of being the same thing as throwing 1 2 3 on the pads. Maybe that's the big difference there, is that kata has this like, kata can have sort of a cultural story behind it, or a visualization element, or I don't mean this in a negative way, but maybe like a
hmm
live action role playing, kind of like putting yourself in the character of the situation element to it.
Yes.
And I think maybe
And
one thing that appeals to people about that is that there's some people that enjoy connecting to that story through kata.
hmm
Like they enjoy
yes.
doing a form and they like the idea of like, okay, I'm doing this form, and this is the form that like farmers that were getting attacked by the samurai that came into their village. This is what they would do with the rake and this and that.
hmm
And maybe there's some people that just get something emotionally and physically out of doing kata, and that's how they connect to their martial art and they enjoy it and that makes them happy, and that's
Yes.
cool. And then there's other people that just want nothing to do with that and they just want to fight and they want to spar and they enjoy the live part of it without that, like, I'm not doing jujitsu imagining that I'm holding a baby and my village is on fire. I'm just rolling with
hmm
somebody and I'm trying to choke them and they're trying to choke me.
Yep.
But everybody connects to martial arts in a different way.
Exactly. Exactly. I would say like the freedom to explore the practice can, I guess, within the realm of your own, like however it is you self-identify. You know, are you an aggressive player, like a skill matrix that I use, inspired by Don Heatrick, I believe is his name, for listeners if you want to reference him on YouTube. Strength and conditioning guy and Muay Thai fighter out of the UK. He he has this 4 category skill matrix: aggressive, tricky, counter, and elusive, that kind of capture all styles of Muay Thai, and you could just stretch that to like all styles of striking for the most part. So you're a guy that is looking to take the fight, or even grappling in this case. Like you are taking the fight to them, right? You are the aggressor in most cases, and that's just how you're going to play. Versus maybe you're waiting on someone. If we talk about jiu-jitsu specifically, maybe you're a counter guy. You want someone to shoot on you, and then you play off of that. You want someone to go for a guard pass or a sub, so you can play off of that, right? Maybe you're the elusive guy, and so then there are overlap. I would say with the other two categories being, I would throw. I wouldn't necessarily say trickiness is a subcategory of aggression, but I think they're more related to each other than elusiveness is to countering, right? Where maybe you are trying to like in addition to being a person who's waiting on the next move, like you're also gonna ghost the person the moment they think the moment they think they're gonna pin you, or the moment they're gonna secure a sub, you're gone. And they face plant and then you take their back or whatever. Or maybe you are a tricky guy where it's like on top of being really aggressive, you're pounding with combos, so you're snapping the head and blasting doubles. Maybe it's I'm gonna blast a double. You're a guy who fakes and feints, right? I'm gonna do a
Right.
double. No, I'm gonna cut an angle. Now I'm gonna push you like all those things. You don't know what this person is gonna do, but they're always but you can navigate that skill matrix accordingly. And again, wherever it is that you as the martial artist feels you fall preferentially as a ratio reflection or a ratio expression of that skill matrix. You're like 50% aggressive, do 20% uh, tricky, and then the remainder from there, elusive and countering. You can just focus on that because that's you. Um, then maybe in the other case, it's okay, like what was going on in the story of this kata, and how like maybe this kata in particular relates to a story that has a ton of overlap with your innate skill matrix, or maybe it doesn't, and it's so something else that when I was talking to my dad last night, I was talking to him just about, hey, this project I have, and just my journey as a martial artist, and he had referenced Bruce Lee, regardless of what you think about him as like a, not you in particular, but listeners, as a as a real martial artist versus maybe just what he wanted to be as a philosophical pioneer. He did something that my dad credited me for, and that's like recreating myself. And so I think active imagination in this case is also an opportunity as a competitor, for myself 13 years into the game, where there's a lot of film on me, and it doesn't mean that like my hero in the sport was Saint Pierre, and he entered the sport a certain way, made a shift after his loss to Matt Serra. Really is probably the most notable shift, and then just basically ran his route all the way out his retirement. And he had some like micro evolutions in that space, but for the most part, when you watch his career, it's like, man, this is a guy who, like, he basically did the same thing every fight over the course of however long he reigned, and no one had an answer for it really until toward the end of his career. And even
Yeah.
and even then he still came back at 85 against a stellar Michael Bisping, who was a champ, and
Yeah.
you
Renega
know
choked him.
yeah, it was fantastic. So I'm like, if you know that fighters are expecting something out of your game or your system, especially if you're a black belt and you approach a theoretical space where you're like, okay, I've climbed all the way up this hypothetical 10-dimensional ladder of martial arts mastery, and I've come back full circle to dimension zero, where I'm just sitting and I see the field, and every point and every point, line, and plane that I could postulate. That's literally what it's a point, line, plane postulate, by the way, if you guys want a reference. These are just really fun ideas that I played around with that have kept the sport A, interesting, and then B, of like I do hope make myself, my practice, and future students standouts in the industry by having a lot of overlap and integrative expression out in the field that people haven't seen. Um, but you have an opportunity now to say, okay, here's the point. Like, if there are, obviously there are an indeterminate amount of ways to approach the game, but let's say you started at point A1. You're like, okay, it's been 10 years. What happens if I started at point B1? Where's the overlap with point A1 through however many other associated points, A1 through A100, and then B1 through B100, and maybe this is in trait, aggression versus tricky, elusive, and counter. Maybe this is in technical pathway. I was an A game choke guy. Now I'm going to be an A game arm lock or leg lock guy. I was an A game throw guy. Maybe now I'm going to be an A game leg tackle or guard pulling type of guy. Uh, and I think that's where like the path to like transcendent skill and like philosophical mastery and enlightenment comes for like the higher degree black belts. It takes time to then just basically say, okay, here is like I can extract the essence of my experience as a martial artist, plug it in as one point. Like every single direction I could go within this matrix of my skill set can be reduced to one point. Boom, I have that. Now let's start fresh. And then you do a similar thing just from a different. You played a video game over again, right? You beat the massive online world game, and you're like, okay, Skyrim fans out there, maybe you're a Khajiit, and maybe now you're going to be a Nord or something, and see how does the game play out there, and maybe there's a character in between, and
Yeah, like
uh,
you usually play Street
yeah,
Fighter and you're Blanca or whatever, and then now I'm going to
boom,
play, Dalsum or E Honda or something like that, and see like, okay,
yeah,
they have this template of techniques. This is their special strengths, weaknesses. So,
yep,
I've reached a certain level I've reached a certain level of jujitsu by, with my E Honda character. So now I'm going to try and see what it's like to start from, I think from an earlier point
hmm
and play the same game, but with Dalsum,
yeah,
stretchy limbs versus like the sumo thing.
exactly. And you just actually inspired another thought where I'm like, man, you don't even have to switch the character. So let's say one character has, I mean, you hit pause, scroll down to like instruction manual, like your moves list. You have like basic moves and then all your signature moves. And you're like,
Yeah.
dang, I beat the game and maxed out my character stats using like 20% of his moves. What if I start over and then like my A game or like these category of his basic moves, and what if I flip it? Like what does that look like
Yeah.
in the character's expression? So you can maybe even stay inside of the quote identity and skill matrix that suits your muscle fiber type and limb length, and
Well, that's kind of interesting because
ever.
that's like, that goes back to the visualization stuff we were talking about where, when I was a blue belt, I was obsessed with Marcelo Garcia, and I think everybody else was too. And, so at that time, Marcelo Garcia's profile of techniques was, he was so physically smaller, explosive, athletic grappler. Profile of techniques was arm drag, back take, rear naked choke, X guard. Um, you know, I think his guard passing was mostly like sit through guard passing. I don't think he had really branched out into like his big guillotine stuff yet. And so, there's this like, this is how this guy grapples. These are the profile of techniques that he uses. This is the system that he uses. If this, then that. And
Hmm.
now I'm going to play that game. I'm going to be Marcelo Garcia for like, 6 months in training sessions. And then what ends up happening is when you kind of simulate a grappler like that, you absorb some things. Like I still have a decent arm drag game. I still play X guard a lot, years later.
Hmm.
Um, but then the things that don't necessarily stick in your game kind of, gradually vanish. And maybe they're replaced with something else when you simulate a different grappler like a Roger Gracie or, somebody else. But, the template that you put on yourself when you mimic a grappler and play their game, certain parts of that vanish. It's almost like you're being, Dalsum or E Honda in Street Fighter, and you play that character for so long that eventually that becomes part of your own grappling, but certain parts of their game vanish. Like maybe I don't do the 1,000 fast sumo hands of E Honda, but I take some other parts of those, like, the techniques the moves that he does, and I keep those. And so then you end up with this like sort of hybrid grappling style as a grappler where, there's still Marcelo Garcia fingerprints on my jiu-jitsu, and there's
Hmm.
Rafa Mendez fingerprints on my jiu-jitsu. And there's also my own fingerprints on my jiu-jitsu because it's me, and I have my own personality and my own body type and my own attributes and my own
Hmm.
influences. But um, it's cool because that's kind of what you were just saying before. Sort of reminded me of that, with that idea of taking on the template of a grappler and then imagining yourself them, and this is the technique profile, and then eventually they fade, but you're still left with their fingerprint on you.
Yeah, man, that's so what you just said circled me to something that hits really close to home. Like this project that I'm building, this like full scale holistic martial arts development model that captures multiple dimensions, of the martial arts training framework is this is really something that I want to pass on to my son. And I think that's you touched on something about like being a kid and like idolizing your heroes, whether it's skateboarding, is Michael Jordan with a tongue out, or a female maybe seeing Ronda Rousey, like, oh my God, a woman's in the UFC
Yeah,
throwing throwing other gals and snapping their arms. Holy crap. And she has a little poofy, we have a girl at our gym who's like 7'5" maybe, or whatever like that. And she's like adopted the same type of thing and she's doing it right now in tournaments. And I'm like, man, like that's, like humans imprint their spirit onto the soul of other humans, and it whatever by whatever process of whatever the process looks like for them of like martial arts can be a very spiritual thing, so as you're like pursuing enlightenment in a case, or just actualizing your full potential, you inspire people, and that becomes an accelerator strip for the next generation to jump into the sport, as training for the sport evolves. But then you also have like all these people with those signature marks, the tongue out. For me, it was Saint Pierre, looking like a goddamn Greek statue, throwing Superman jabs and double legging people with perfect timing and position,
yeah,
like that. It took him black belt development in karate and jiu-jitsu, training with the Olympic Canadian team, cross training, between Montreal, going to New York to work with Muay Thai specialist Phil Nurse, and at the time the Death Squad with John Donaher before they moved out to Austin, and then eventually hitting up Albuquerque. He went out and trained with Jackson, Greg Jackson and Mike Winklejohn,
yeah,
and then even with Freddie Roach, boxing coach to Manny Pacquiao. He was one of the first athletes to recognize the utility in what I'm calling like my goal, like assembling the spirit of martial arts. Like the spirit in this case really is like the aggregate experience of a person embodied through their practice, right? So the instructor learned from instructors and kind of absorbed the quote energy from their students based on the region they're in, the type of school they're in, right? That's an energy ball, so to speak, resting in the person and how they move,
yeah,
and they transmit that then to their students. But if you can just observe that, there's something about their their spirit, their energy, so to speak, that ignites your spark, your quirk. You're like, oh, that just feels like something resonant with my soul,
hmm,
and I can't put it into words yet, but I can just do it. Like like I just understand it fundamentally. It's unconscious right now, but someday I'll be able to put it into words, right? Like that's a cheat code, man, and that's a when you think about creating a system that inspires people, and I watch like my son, like I have he came to the weight room today. The boy's all of 2.5 feet tall, whatever, like 24 pounds, and he's watching dad lift weights, and he goes and just picks up a 13 pound, he picks up like over 50% of his body weight, where he looks at me and like, he steals my smoothie. I blend like a protein smoothie with fruits and veggies and stuff like that, pre-workout or whatever, and he'll grow up like, oh, you want dad's muscle shake, and he'll go up and flex his muscles, like
oh my
he's
god,
already, it's dude, it melts
that's the
my heart.
cutest thing.
Dude, but that's just like that's the human condition,
Yeah,
and whether it's a son to his father, a daughter to his father, like, whether it's within family or extended family, like I consider the martial arts community, you guys at the jiu-jitsu company, your
hmm,
family to me. When I
yeah,
see something really awesome you guys are speaking about, or when I engage with you guys, in jujitsu practice, like that, there are some things that are just permanently stained to my nervous system, and some of which I'm still, I'll recognize maybe in training, or I'm like, huh, I picked that up from Josh and them. That's really cool that he had an impact, like he had a subliminal impact, like just beneath my conscious awareness, but something about my brain's observation of this experience with him saw enough value to instantly assimilate it into my being. Like
Yeah, and we all
that's
influence each other. It's like when I read your Instagram posts, like your post competition reflections. Like it's the same thing. I think we all have a similar mindset, and it makes it easier to kind of, you know, influence each other. And we all get along, which helps a lot too, because I like you and I like Mike and I like Crystal. And, so like when I see you guys do something cool, I'm like, oh shit, that's awesome. Like they're
yep.
cool. That makes sense. I'm going to, that makes it easier to like absorb and imprint and, um,
Hmm.
take some of that information. Yeah. Super cool. Well, Will, it's about 3:45, so I gotta start heading out in a minute. Did you have anything that you wanted to finish up with before we call it a day?
Oh, I think we touched on a lot of subjects that are kind of comprehensive in by their own merit. I really do hope listeners can take away some really cool ideas for their own training, whether you're in charge of your development explicitly or if you're part of a program and wondering how to make the most out of your training. If you have a facility or, senseis or coaches that allow for some autonomy, then I think this conversation would be a great entry point into like self-generated periodization, right? Like you kind of playing around with your schedule on a weekly, monthly, and quarterly up to annual basis so that you get more out of your training, and maybe even exploring different avenues for martial arts development and competition, and just for the sake of the practice. Like maybe there's a new lens, a new set of glasses you can put on. Uh, Thinking about training development as a spectrum, in many facets. You'll hear Mike and I echo this often. We have technical, tactical, and strategic development, and you can reduce that all the way down as far as you like for the sports scientists. If you're thinking about performance and rehabilitation, uh, you can think about the joint motions themselves and scale it all the way up to the full body moving as a system with someone else. For strength and conditioning coaches, you can think about the energy metabolic demands of different skill types required in the school of striking and school of grappling, and how you would program for an athlete or yourself given the demands of their training program to ensure that you reduce the risk of training overuse injuries. Um, and then overall, I hope you guys just had fun. We had some cool analogies. You bring it up the Street Fighter crossover. We have officially, with the superpowers of technology, we have AI super processors that can help us auto regulate with more precision. Like you can engage with it subjectively, and it will help you produce better objective outcomes. This is the game theoretical stage of skill development for any domain you desire. And if you're looking for something to truly optimize your performance, this conversation again is a great starting point. Definitely check out Renaissance Periodization,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Mike Israel, Dr. Krista Guevara, Josh Vogel, and all other collaborators. The RP Hypertrophy app as a great way to really streamline your strength training. I have some really interesting ideas that I'm going to be pumping out on social media on how to weave that into your skill development for martial arts as well. Follow me on Instagram, that's two E's, the Will Starks. And guys, just watch my journey. I'm trying to be an ambassador for this science-based metaphysical approach to martial arts skill mastery.
Awesome. I love it. Well, thanks a lot for coming on. And yeah, uh, we'll talk soon. We should get on a phone call just to talk about the gamma stuff that we were texting about earlier. But
Hmm.
yeah, everybody follow Will. Listen to him. He's smart. He knows things. Yeah, and Will, I will catch up with you later. All right, buddy?
Yes, sir, man. It's a pleasure being on. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you.